Welcome to Foucault 213. I'm turning to the first page of Théorie et institution pénale. Pas d'introduction. La raison d'être de ce cours, il suffit d'ouvrir les yeux. Ceux qui y répugneraient s'y trouveront dans ce que j'ai dit.
Oui, d'accord.
No introduction. The reason for these lectures, one need only open one's eyes. The second set of manuscripts resonate with all the passion, impatience, verve, and engagement that Foucault would invest in his lectures at the Collège de France. The object, he tells us immediately, is the theories, institutions, and practices of punishment. And he then launches full bore into what is effectively two sets of lectures in this second lecture series. The first is a minute and detailed narrative of the repression of the peasant rebellions in Normandy in 1639 and 1640, in order to trace the emergence of an autonomous, repressive apparatus different from the army, separate from the king in Paris, distinct from the other royal institutions like the local parliaments and office holders. A repressive apparatus that combines the judicial and the policing function, and that in a radically new way at the time, in 1638, combines the civil and the military. Very importantly, the person in charge, the chancelier Séguier, uses civil authority to deploy military justice and takes military power as a civilian, and at the same time exercises divine power, conducting the final judgment over everyone, including the nobles and the parliamentarians. Then, in a second moment, Foucault turns to Germanic law and medieval penal practices in order to reveal a fundamental transition from a model of war and struggle for truth, the Germanic practices of private wars and regulated struggle, to the model of the judicial inquest, judicial institutions, and the search for truth. Yes, he will say, there are surely hangovers from the earlier model of war in the medieval period. Sermons, ordeals, the duel. But what we see is the emergence in the medieval age of a whole new model of truth production that is modeled on the method of the inquiry. And so we go on page 201 of his lectures from the événement épreuve to the enquête vérité. A gradual displacement will take place over time, a displacement towards the production of truth and imposition of knowledge. From the event test, we pass to the truth inquiry. With royal justice, with the royal cases, the royal prosecutors, the judge, the trial process, we pass to a model no longer of war, but of the inquest for truth. And he writes on page 201, La pièce de remplacement permettant de passer d'un pouvoir gardien de l'ordre à un pouvoir portant la sentence, c'est l'enquête vérité. The replacement piece, which permits us to pass from a guardian power of order to a power that carries the sentence, that is the truth inquest. And royal justice will impose a knowledge which is very different from the feudal justice, which he describes, for instance, on page 117 of the lectures, where he says in the earlier period, La justice ne s'impose pas, elle est constituée par la volonté des individus en litige. Justice doesn't impose itself in that earlier period. It is constituted by the will of the individuals in litigation. In sum, from a series of tests modeled on war and combat, penality transitioned to a model of knowledge and truth. One need only open one's eyes. Yes, because this is, of course, the history of the present. And so what we have on pages 138 and 139 of the lectures is his opening our eyes. Remarques générales, general remarks. General remarks about the distinction between the system of penality in medieval age and our contemporary system of punishment. One that moved from seizing property, he says, in the medieval age, to excluding individuals. One that moved from the fiscal to the carceral. Who compensated whom becomes who detains whom. From exchange, we have moved to exclusion. And many of the practices are the same. La mort, death, mutilation, avowal, imprisonment. Many of those forms remain present, but they take on very different meaning. Mutilation, or the avowal, moves from confession to recognition. And imprisonment moves from the gage to being extracted from society. One need only open one's eyes to see the function today of the penal system. In these lectures, Foucault addresses central questions of the formation of the state, the formation of the judicial and policing apparatus of repression, and the relationship between penality and political economy. These lectures cover a lot of ground and many centuries, and to prepare them for publication, we consulted with many historians and philosophers who read the manuscript with us and shared their indications, and to whom we are extremely grateful. Yves-Marie Berset read the entire lectures and gave us his feedback. He would write the definitive treatment of the Nu-Pieds rebellion just a few years after these lectures in 1974. Albert Rigaudière, a great historian of medieval juridical practices, Jacques Rinen, a great legal historian of the Middle Ages, Arnaud Tessier would also help us with these lectures, the biographer of Richelieu and the editor of Richelieu's Testament Politique, Dominique Lecourt on the relationship to Canguilhem, the history of science, and of course when I say we, I'm mostly referring to François Eval, the general editor of these lectures, who led the inquest. Most importantly, because these lectures are in a silent conversation with Althusser, and through him Marx, we were honored to have Etienne Balibar read through the lectures and help us think through them, and Etienne Balibar provided a remarkably insightful contribution, which we were able to publish in the volume as well. As Daniel Defer remarked in his situation of the first lecture series, Lectures on the Will to Know, there was a rich silent conversation with Deleuze, especially his reading of Nietzsche and his work Différence et Répétition, Répétition et Différence. Here, with the turn to state apparatuses and the focus on state formation, there's an ongoing and rich and deep conversation with Althusser. And you see it throughout the text in these passages where he makes methodological interruptions. On page 133, where he says, speaking of penal practices, he says they are not or not only part of the superstructures. Or on page 172, where he says that les rapports de pouvoir, relations of power, are as deep as les rapports de production. Ils ne se déduisent pas les uns des autres. Ils reconduisent des uns aux autres. Or on page 198, where he tells us that effects of knowledge are distinct of ideological operations. So this rich conversation with Althusser is, I think, what brings us here today. And we thought it would be most appropriate to discuss these lectures with Etienne Balibar and François Ewald. I think I speak for myself and everyone here in the room when I say that we are thrilled and honored that Etienne Balibar has joined our faculty at Columbia University. Etienne Balibar is a leading French philosopher and now professor at Columbia. His publications in English include Reading Capital with Louis Althusser, Race, Nation, Class, We, the People of Europe, 2003, The Philosophy of Marx, 2007, Identity and Difference on John Locke and the Innovation of Consciousness, 2013, Équiliberté, Political Essays, 2013, Citizenship, 2015, and most recently, Violence and Civility on the Limits of Political Philosophy, published in 2015 by Columbia University Press, a set of lectures that were delivered at Irvine under the auspices of the Critical Theory Institute. Professor Balibar is currently teaching a seminar on Foucault's criticisms of Marxism at Columbia here. And he is also emeritus professor at Université of Paris, Nanterre, and at UC Irvine. François Robert Ewald is the general editor of the entire series of lectures that we're studying this year at the Collège de France, and was Foucault's principal assistant at the Collège de France. We owe him a great debt of gratitude for the publication of this series and for writing all of the editors with a whip and a smile. It was my great privilege to work so closely with François on this particular volume. Currently, François Ewald chairs the scientific committee at the Université de l'Assurance and is a fellow of the French Technological Academy. Ewald recently retired as professor of insurance at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris and as director of the École Nationale d'Assurance. And his research interests are in the fields of risk and the philosophy of risk, and his publications include L'État-providence from 1986 and Le Principe de Précaution, 2001-2008. A young Maoist who met Foucault at around this time in the northern Pas-de-Calais during the political turmoil surrounding the mining accidents and a particular crime in Lens. François Ewald would work closely with Foucault throughout all of these lectures and then dedicate much of his energies to publishing Les Dits et Écrits, the collected interviews and other writings of Foucault with Daniel Defer, and of course the Collège de France lectures. Incidentally, Professor Ewald will be speaking tomorrow on neoliberalism at Hunter College in Sanford Schramm's marvelous CUNY workshop on neoliberalism, and that's going to be tomorrow at 2:30, from 2:30 to 4 in Roosevelt House 204 at Hunter. So if you want more on the 78 and 79 lectures and that entire debate, never too much. Following the introductory comments by Etienne Balibar and François Ewald, my colleague and friend and co-convener and our host here at the Casa Hispanica, and the chair of the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures, will formulate questions to lead our discussion. I'll make one final announcement, which I will repeat at the end. The next time we meet is October 12th for The Punitive Society. The book is hot off the press. First copies in existence in America are actually sitting outside the door with Book Culture. So please feel free to pick one up, and that's where we'll be turning in a couple of weeks. Etienne, may I ask you to start us off?
Don't you think François should speak first?
No.
It's not that I don't want to speak, it's just that I would find it... but it's absolutely up to you. What do you prefer?
No, you make it.
I go first. Okay. So, the whip will be waiting me, of course.
Yes.
And the smile is already there. Very good. Okay. Thank you so much, Bernard and Jesus. Needless to say, can you hear me? Should I speak louder? No. Louder. Okay. I'm delighted to be here tonight for that discussion. A little worried, of course. Not uneasy, but uncertain. We'll see how it goes. I count on François to not to smash, but to, and the others, of course, to correct what I'm going to say. You know, this is a very strange situation. I was shown by you and François, but in fact it came through you, almost exactly a year ago. I believe it was in December, just before the end of the term. These proofs that you already had with you for the text and for the notes. And I mean, the preliminary version of the notes, if I well remember. Incidentally, these notes, these erudite and philosophical and historical notes by Claude Olivier Doron are a marvel. I mean, I think I'm extremely admirative, and I think everybody will draw a huge benefit. In fact, for reasons which I'm going to go into in a minute, I think the text would be barely readable without the notes and without your situation jointly written by the two of you, which might even substitute the text, perhaps. I mean, so I was shown all this, and I had one night to react, because you said to me, could you have an eye, but it's very urgent. There are many allusions to Althusser. I mean, that was why I was brought in, as most of the time in my life. It's because I'm a sort of posthumous warden of the temple, you know, and so you wanted me to say if you were correct in thinking what you have just repeated, that is, that a conversation, silent but easy to nevertheless to identify with Althusser was playing an important role in the text. So. Of course, I would not resist the temptation and the provocation in the positive sense of the term. So I spent the night reading all that. I have to say, with great excitement, and on the spot, and in the wake of that reading, I sent you that email, where I said essentially there is even more than what you had imagined, and I can try and explain why and in which sense. But of course, I'm not an objective reader. I mean, to find the trace of Althusser in whichever text, and especially his Foucault, is something that belongs, unfortunately or fortunately, to my pedigree. So I wrote that email to you, and I made it as sharp as I could. I said, this is the first moment in the great settlement of accounts that Foucault carried on with Marxism, and of course inevitably also with Althusser during that period. And then you proposed to have the letter published in the volume, so I'm trapped now, because these words are forever what I have to say about the encounter itself. And then, of course, in the situation, one of you or you two together took up the provocation and started making corrections, which I'm sure you continue today. I mean, you said no, it's not a settlement of account. It's a counter Marxism. Right? I'm happy to, as you will see, to adopt this formula. Okay, so. As Napoleon said, on s'avance et puis on voit. You enter the battlefield, and only then you see where you are and what it's about, what the battle exactly consists of. I wish I really saw, but as I reread the text, it became somewhat more complicated than what I had thought initially. Okay.
We'll do a second. We'll do a second edition.
Yes. No. I'm not going to. No. Now it's for the others. Okay. So since I'm the first to speak, and you have proposed a beautiful general introduction to the importance of that text, which I will not deny, But I'm suspecting that very few here have read the text or even have it in their hands. I'm not going to summarize. You explained perfectly what the two movements are. But I want to say that I'm somewhat perplexed about the kind of use of that text that readers, whether French or American, but perhaps especially American, will have in the future. This is why I said that perhaps the situation and the notes could substitute the text. This has to do, I mean, I don't want to discourage people to buy it, but these are notes. These are preparatory notes, and I think Aurélie La Volonté de Savoir, the first year,
Yes.
has the same status. But I have a feeling that in this case, correct me if you disagree, the lacunary character, I would say, of the text is even more visible. When I say lacunary, this is not to say that something is hidden. It's the opposite in a sense. I mean, what we have here clearly, and you will again. I mean, I hope immediately say if I'm right or not, but. Believe it or not, I never went to the Collège de France to listen to Foucault's lectures. So that says a lot about the narrow-mindedness or the divisions, the divides that existed at the time, or the silly reasons of the kind. Oh yes, it would be great, but I have other things to do. Blah 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 blah. And so I never saw Foucault lecturing, but there are. Video, there are images. I mean, we can say so. My impression is that Foucault followed very closely the plan of what he had prepared, and the text is clearly already containing some of the formulas or the statements that he wanted to put at the center of the lecture, and all the references incredibly erudite and but also impossible to justify. I mean, why not? Why this, not that, etc. And the quotations, etc., are there. But then a living orator, and what an orator, I mean, would transform all this into a discourse. And for the other subsequent lectures, we have that discourse, which is continuous, which is dramatic, which is convincing, I mean, and which makes undoubtedly of this series of lectures a great. I mean, it gives a deep sense to the notion of teaching. I mean, it's like Heidegger's lectures. I mean, I had always thought that Heidegger was a totally esoteric and impenetrable writer because I knew only the French translations of his books, you know. And at some point, I started reading his public lectures. I thought there's no esotericism at all there. I mean, so we could take other examples. We don't have this here. So it makes the reading a little difficult, perhaps. But on the other hand, of course, it makes the studying, I would say, of the text all the more interesting and valuable. And this is also, of course, one of the reasons why you should, I believe, read this seminar in permanent comparison with others or other moments in Foucault's intellectual development, and with certain questions in mind. So I would do something very unfair to you, but François sent me his plan for what he's going to, and essentially, I mean, I put it, he's going to argue that Foucault, in fact, was not interested in the question of the state, but in another question, which is part. That's the core, of course, of the problem that we need to discuss. And this is also, in a sense, why I was hoping to speak after you, because I want to not to say exactly the opposite, but to try and, well, in the end, we will see where we get. And so we must have questions in mind, and the question of the genealogy of the state and the birth of the state is crucial. One last thing, what I find that Olivier Doron's notes also beautifully illustrate, I believe, is the extent to which Foucault, who certainly was always a historian, or did never draw any line of demarcation between philosophy and history and politics, if perhaps as their articulating element. That's his signature position on both realms. Is here in a sense, and I think consciously and purposely entering the field of a pre-existing historical controversy. I mean, that's which involves Marxists and non-Marxists. So this is something that the notes explain. I brought here one of the two pieces of the controversy, which is a main source of Foucault's text, and as I argued in my letter to the editors, also adds to the meaning of the encounter with Althusser, because it's also, not by chance, something that Foucault doesn't say here, of course, explicitly, Althusser's main source when he himself, in a different form, dealt with the question of the importance of the French absolute monarchy in devising, in forming the modern state machine or state apparatus in his, for the first time. Later he returned to that, but in his little book on Montesquieu, this is the large work by Soviet historian Boris Porshnev with the title Les soulèvements populaires en France de 1623 à 1648, Popular Uprisings in France 1623-1648, which tells the story of the rebellion of the nu-pieds, the barefoot, the nu-pieds, which is at the center of half about of Foucault's lecture, and was published in French completely, in a complete edition, only belatedly. That's 63. And at the beginning of the French translation, which I took from the library here, there's a very funny note which says something about the tensions and the complexity of the field that Foucault was entering and was treading. The footnote at on the first page, avant-propos de l'éditeur, by Robert Mandrou, very, very famous historian of French 17th century society and monarchy at the time. He writes the following: Certains s'étonneront peut-être qu'il ait fallu 10 ans pour qu'un groupe d'historiens se décide à mettre en chantier la traduction de livres. Some people might be surprised that it took 10 years for a group of historians to embark on the translation of this book. Le Centre de recherche historique a effectivement hésité longuement. This is a mixture of incredible, it's not hypocrisy, but suppositions. I mean, le Centre de recherche historique a effectivement hésité longuement, the Center for Historical Research of the Sorbonne, of course, in effect, hesitated very long before, avant de l'entreprendre, before starting to do it, pensant que les historiens communistes français revendiqueraient l'honneur de cette traduction, because they were convinced that the French communist historians would claim the honor of doing that translation for themselves. In fact, Porchnev's book, which was known through partial translations, a full German translation that Althusser had used, and of course the debates it had launched in the Soviet Union was found itself in very strange position, because from the Marxist point of view it was not considered perfectly orthodox. I will hope to have the time to say in a minute quickly why. And on the other hand, of course, it was received. So the French communist historians were not so keen in a sense. Perhaps I simplify, although there were great admirers, of course, of the book. And on the other hand, of course, the Sorbonne perceived that as a very dangerous challenge of Marxist historiography on what certainly was the point of honor precisely of French historiography and historical theory, and I might even say the French ideology as such. Which leads me to another quick remark concerning the effect that Foucault's text may have on a French reader, and that it perhaps wouldn't have immediately in the same manner on an American reader. These are the palimpsestic elements. I see. If you the hero of this course, series of lecture, or the great figure that Foucault organizes his presentation around. In the first, all the first series of lectures, when he tells the story of the repression of the Nu-Pieds rebellion, and repression is the title of the lengthy chapter that Porchnev himself writes at the end of this book. The hero is Chancelier Séguier. Now, of course, when we had in Paris a presentation with extraordinary, remarkable historians and archivists who knew all that by heart, they were all convinced that Séguier is a major figure in the history of the construction of the French state machine. He was Richelieu's, Cardinal de Richelieu's bras droit, I mean, etc. But outside this limited realm, and especially in America, nobody has heard about Chancelier Séguier. A French man, in my generation at least, knows Séguier for another two reasons, and which I'm sorry if I waste your time with these anecdotes, which I will tell you. First is we all read 1, 2, 3, 10 times Les Trois Mousquetaires by Alexandre Dumas, the famous novel, I mean, epic novel on the history of 17th century France. And there is a dramatic moment in the novel where Chancelier Séguier enters the scene. And he enters the scene in a theatrical manner, which also is supposed to provoke fear, because he's the man who carries for Richelieu the repressive. And the second reason why Séguier is known of French in French culture is that he was the direct protector of the Pascal family, that is Blaise Pascal, the famous theologian and philosopher, and his father, who were themselves direct agents of the French fiscal administration, and playing, in fact, a role in the events that are described here. Okay, that's too long. So let me come to my main point. First of all, I would like to draw your attention to three points on which I will be relatively quick. The first is that this lectures, this series of lectures, you quoted the very first phrase, but that comes right after that, during the first lecture, raises an amazing claim. I mean, expresses an amazing claim, which is to write a history of the naissance de l'État, the birth of the state. So that will perhaps be what François will want to, in a sense, twist in a different direction. Suffice it for me to say here that naissance, of course, is never an innocent term in Foucault. Several of his books are called Naissance of something, Naissance de la clinique, so that's a discipline or a discourse. Naissance de la prison, that's the subtitle of Discipline and Punish, and there are probably others. But of course, in each case, you have, on the one hand, and I don't spend time on that, although it's very interesting, a reference to the Nietzschean terminology which lies at the root of the idea and the practice of genealogy, even before Foucault has officially defined his method as a genealogical method. That is something which deals with Ursprung and Herkunft, and in fact with the complicated, non-dialectical, but certainly paradoxical relationship that exists between the functioning and the transformations of an institution and its beginning or starting point. Maybe it's a little quick, but I would say that the general scheme is that the development is bound to betray the origin. That's Foucault's, or produce a displacement. And that's clearly shown and demonstrated in the cases I mentioned. But in the case of the state, it becomes a much more challenging object, of course. And so, because the state is not a partial institution, it's, at least in the philosophical tradition, not only Hegelian, it's the whole. So the birth of the state, that the birth of the general fabric of the society, unless, which will be my hypothesis, and in this case I don't believe that, we'll see if we disagree on that, unless Foucault's implicit idea is to demonstrate that the state is not the whole or the general framework where society is organized, but is in fact a partial, particular institution, however important it is. Second point which I would like to insist on, coming to the question, the complex question of power. So my tendency here, but I admit that I'm bending the stick in one direction, and I can understand if you want to bend the stick in the other direction, so I push it as much as I can in one direction. My suggestion is not to read already, if you like, in what Althusser would have called a teleological manner. I would say if it exists, the theory of power as relation, power as a force of subjectivation, or that Foucault will fully develop in later years. I would not deny that this problem is now entering the scene in a way that had no exact or full precedent in previous texts. I would not deny either that this insistence on the question of power is linked to the political conjuncture and the debates that you alluded to and that you both referred to in your situation, namely the post-68 moment in which repression as such, and called as such, of course, vindicated by the state, confronts the rebellious, revolutionary, however you want to call them, post-68 movements, and particularly the Maoist movement, of course, with which Foucault had specific and very tight relations. But I tend, at least this is my current reading, to find it perhaps more interesting and suggestive to read this as a transitory moment, as a conjuncture in which a new problem is introduced, whose perfect formalization, or whose adequate definition, if you prefer, and certainly whose various dimensions are yet completely to unravel and describe. Reason why, also I again agree on this point in your situation, where you devote beautiful pages to the importance of the category of experience in Foucault's writing and thinking at the time, and in fact throughout his career. I would personally add to that not only we have the text in fragmentary, etc., but the text has a profoundly experimental character. I mean, I believe that Foucault is experimenting with the question of power, and so there are elements which are coming to the fore. They're not necessarily those which will remain central, and some of them might even become dropped. And it is in this respect, in a sense, that the confrontation with Althusser is particularly interesting, because some of these elements are, I mean, they're always over-determined. Some of these elements are prompted by this confrontation with Althusser's Marxism, and in a sense, they will no longer be so necessary. So, trying to finish on that, every reader, of course, will be struck by the fact that Foucault describes the construction of the state power and state apparatus in strategic terms of evolving relationships of forces, and that he devotes a very explicit, he insists on the fact that the model or the central category is the category of the civil war. This is not the end, of course, of his references to civil war in later texts. But in that respect, there are two additional elements which I find particularly interesting. One of them, so do they disappear? Partly, yes. I mean, they don't keep exactly the same function later. One of them has to do with the idea of not only of civil war, but the idea of double power. Double power. So, of course, an old Leninist like me cannot not be struck by that. You were a Maoist, but I was a Leninist, you know. And so we all knew by heart that, and we repeated that all the time, that the typical characteristic of the revolutionary situation, as described by Lenin, is the emergence of a double power. And I'm very struck by the fact that precisely in the first half of the class, which deals with the Révolte des Nu-Pieds, Foucault is so insistent on the idea that this is double power situation. The Nu-Pieds really are another power, in the full sense of the term, not only because they are dangerous, not only because they gather troops, etc., around them, but because they built a mimetic image of the state or something of the state in the form of a symbolic construction centered on the very strange figure of Jean Nupier, the general of the army of the poor, with a kind of subcomandante Marcos of the time. You know that? Yeah, absolutely. But with the exception that, of course, well, the question whether Jean Nupier really existed or not is not settled. So that may have been a fiction constructed by the army of the Nupier in order precisely to challenge the power of the state. So the second element. So this is. Linked, in my opinion, to something I will leave aside Clausewitz for another moment, but this is linked to, of course, a very interesting and also a particular way of describing the Civil War as a social war. This Civil War is a class struggle, undoubtedly. And here the counter-Marxism begins to enter the pattern, because the groups are defined by through interests and relationships of domination, and are broadly located in the horizon of a historic transition between, say, feudalism and capitalism. But nevertheless, this class struggle is not a dualistic one, and it's not a dualistic one. There are many groups, because it is not, I'd say, structurally polarized. The polarization is a conjunctural, it's even an accidental one, which will prove decisive for the birth of the state. And it's produced in two manners. On the one side, the counterpower of the nu-pied, the barefoot, and its mimetic rivalry with the monarchy forces the state to take it seriously. And on the other side, of course, the state, or the would-be state, I mean, would-be modern state, co-opts, so to speak, this challenge, and uses it to define, in quasi-Schmittian terms, I would say, an enemy, a social enemy, and that is the revolt against the fiscal. So this is what produces polarization, and so to speak, spectrally gives rise to a standard figure of the class struggle, which remains precarious and incomplete. And the second aspect, which I want to insist on in Foucault's description, has to do with the theatralization, or how do you say, theatricalization or theatralization? Theatralization of power, which plays such an amazing role in the text, and the insistence of Foucault on the way in which, in order to create, so to speak, in the representation, this was the beginning of the time when a number of French historians and art critics, I verified, Apostolides and Louis Marin wrote a little later than that, but became so much interested, and Althusser as well, in fact, in his book on Machiavelli, on the question of the monarchic state machine as a theatrical machine that produces representation, and in that way subjects or imposes obedience to its own subject. So Foucault is also interested in that. I don't know if at the time he had already read Kantorowicz, but he makes an interesting use of the category of the body. This is a visible body. And this visible body is of course Body of state, created through the theatrical mise en scène, staging of power that Séguier precisely performs. And so this is essential to understand the moment in which the body of the state becomes at the same time relatively autonomous with respect of the person of the king, but also on the other hand rising and imposing, in every sense of the term, its power over the various administrations, apparatuses, etc., in the ceremony of justice. Now, this theatricalization of the body of the state and the functioning of the apparatus is, of course, equally important in Althusser's phenomenology, I would say, of the state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus in particular, with the question of the ritual at the center. And here I have two questions to which I will come now, which are, on the one hand, what became of that interest and that insistence on the grand, I would say, theatricalization inherent in the working of the state in his later work. We find all sorts of traces, of course, which are very interesting. They are usually located, such as the supplies of Damien at the beginning of punishment and discipline and punish, to characterize the archaic moment, or if not the archaic, the transition moment from which the actual construction of the modern administration of justice and penal system will depart, which is not to say that there won't be any ritual more, but the rituals won't have that spectacular quality, and for that reason they also won't have that symbolic resonance. So put very brutally and roughly, Foucault was interested in something of the symbolic instance at this moment that he preferred later to more or less marginalize, to become more pedestrian, if you like, in his description of the functioning, etc. And that may have to do with the alternative power or state. Finally, what I want to say, cut me if I have been too long. What I want to say concerns the question, the notion of the apparatus and the uses of the category apparatus in Foucault's text. Now, since I won't have time to go as far as that, I will anticipate something that I wanted to say in the conclusion, and I would say that my feeling, but we may discuss that, my feeling is that at the level of the writing, and I take so if this is writing, it's writing in preparation for talking. So there's a sabbath. But my with all these precautions, my qualitative feeling, if you like, in the second reading I make of the text, is that the categories power and apparatus are roughly of equivalent importance, and I would say equivalent weight in the text. This is where we might disagree. Now, if we had time, but that will come perhaps in the discussion, this would be the place to explain that, of course, in the standard Marxist or rather Leninist organization of this question, the two categories were intimately linked and connected, but there was, especially in Lenin, a kind of primacy of the category of power over the category of apparatus. Apparatuses, whichever nature, were the instruments. You even have incredible passages where Lenin, in the middle of the revolution, and that was not innocent, because that had certain very specific consequences, wrote such things as the state apparatus is a stick that the class power or the state power must seize from the hands of its previous owners in order to turn it against them and smash them. Whereas in the Maoist reading of this whole question, the transition towards communism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and so on, I keep receiving letters from China asking me, do you still think that the dictatorship of the proletariat could return, etc.? Okay, leave that. So in the Maoist, or at least in what, and here I believe that with all our differences and even conflicts and antagonism, we essentially relied on the same vulgata, I would say, that we received from China. So, and Althusser tried to elaborate on that. The great idea was that the question of the apparatus was much more important than the question of the power. The question of the apparatus was the decisive question, because to seize power in the sense of state power, of course, that's not Foucault's power or power relations, doesn't change the society as such. What can change the society over the long term and the social relations as such is a deep transformation within the state machine and the apparatuses in general, to which Althusser wanted to add something more. Now, my impression is that in Foucault's text, the two categories are roughly, as I said, of equal weight, and they are very frequently exchanging their functions. That is, it is important to explain that an apparatus, in fact, is nothing else than a system of power relations, which, like all power relations, Foucault already is firmly convinced of that, remains precarious, can be reversed, can suffer strategic reversals and transformation. His problem, as we know, was always with that. There are interviews which are very clear. Power relations intrinsically, ontologically, I'm tempted to say, are reversible. But domination, relationships of domination, for example, the masculine domination over women, or perhaps others, that's a more difficult problem. So in any case, apparatuses are made of, consist of power relations which have that strategic, quasi-ontological flexibility. But conversely, the relations of power that Foucault describes here essentially consist of apparatuses and the construction of apparatuses. And one of them, of course, is more important, you already insisted on that, than any other. It's the apparatus of justice. So I agree, of course, that this is Foucault's central concern, and it's around that question of the formation of the apparatus of justice, of the judiciary machine, if you like, the judiciary and penal machine in all its complexity and its transformations, that the course is written. Returning for a minute to Althusser, this is, of course, very interesting because I clearly perceive that Foucault is taking seriously, I would say not the challenge, but the proposition that you find in Althusser to analytically distinguish between repressive apparatuses and ideological apparatuses. After which, in a passage, I wrote it, but leave that, I can quote it off memory. In a passage of his text, which certainly Foucault had read very carefully, Althusser writes something which at the same time may appear as a welcome dialectical improvement, but also as a kind of miserable rhetorical trick. He says, in fact, all concrete apparatuses are at the same time repressive and ideological. They must function on both planes or on both sides, except, he adds, that there is a prevalence. So the police on one side and the school or the church on the other side are not equally implementing repressive and ideological functions or procedures. So I believe that Foucault here, if we read it, well, the important thing is what he says about the emergence of the judicial apparatuses. But if we read it in the perspective of that confrontation, I think that he's exhibiting an apparatus that, in fact, is impossible to understand or analyze according to that duality. So it's not the case that justice would be repressive and ideological in Althusser's sense. It is repressive in a sense that Althusser has not understood, which combines a number of specific functions. Now, that leads me to the final remark. I also had one on law, but that may return on the later discussion, that I wanted to make about counter-Marxism and counter-Althusserianism, if you allow me. The remark on counter-Marxism, I will accept this formula very gladly, that I want to make concerns Foucault's invention, Foucault's terminological invention, I'm tempted to say inflation, of categories which are modeled, I would say, on the Marxist category, on the Marxist terminology, which include progressively surproduit, that's surplus product, surpouvoir, surplus power, and eventually, even if briefly, sursavoir, surplus knowledge, to describe the way in which, as you said, the new judicial apparatus extracts through inquiry and at some point also examination the knowledge that it needs in order to organize its social repressive function. So, as I said in the letter that I was writing to you and that you reproduced, this was something that was in the air at the time. Lacan did the same in exactly the same period. The characteristic of Foucault's writing in this text is that it sticks very closely to the Marxian source, but he uses it in say, non-orthodox manners. And it is here that it's interesting to return to Porchnev, because one of the things that had produced the controversies around Porchnev's understanding of class struggles in the Fronde was the insistence that Porchnev put on the question of fiscal exploitation, fiscal pressure, la pression fiscale, and the idea that in this phase of transition phase to the modern state, call it capitalist if you like, in fact, the fiscal extortion was more important than the class struggles in the classic sense of the term, which meant that, in fact, the state, that's something that always interested Foucault, is the question of the primitive accumulation, but it's also the question implicitly at the horizon of what the Soviet state was doing in its own primitive accumulation, so to speak. So the class, the relationship between exploited and exploiting class are more or less receding, and what comes to the fore is the relationship between taxes, rebellions, and justice. So it is on that basis that Foucault constructs his alternative, I would say, to the classical Marxist theory of the relationship between surplus labor and surplus value. As a consequence, when he writes that the prison, the invention of the prison, has an intimate link with the birth of capitalism, it doesn't have at all, I think, the meaning that it will acquire the year after. We'll talk about that, of course, next time. In the punitive society, where Foucault, engaging Marx, I would say even more closely, and that time it will be Marx's Capital, goes as far as explaining that the prison and the fabric have the same management of time and the productivity of time. You have none of that. You have none of that here. It's a pure question of politics. And that leads me to my very final remark. Foucault took Althusser's challenge, I would say, so seriously that while rejecting the articulation ideology repression, he nevertheless, it seems to me, tried to propose something like an equivalent for that articulation. So he identified in Althusser something that, and in the case of Althusser, that was, of course, regrettable, contrary to his intention, that was deeply teleological. That was precisely the idea that ideology and repression simultaneously or combined with one another work to produce the reproduction of the capitalist relations of production. This is in the course of the year after, Foucault will change his position on the question of reproduction. He will return to Marx's Capital. He will leave aside Althusser's understanding of reproduction, and he will introduce something that, in fact, is already a biopolitical sketch of capitalist reproduction processes. But here he contents himself with inventing, I would say, another double relationship, which, of course, you might be tempted to simply call power knowledge articulation, but I'm tempted to take his terminology here very seriously. Not power knowledge, but surplus power and surplus knowledge. That is, the articulation of both is read and understood at the level of the intrinsic violence and excess that the judiciary apparatus establishes between them. And to put it simply and quickly in the terms of Foucault's later formulation, this is the repressive hypothesis, I would say, as such. So my intention was to show that Foucault, at some point at least, had elaborated his own version of the repressive hypothesis, which made it, of course, all the more important and productive, I would say, or fruitful for him later to reverse some of its content. I'm very, very sorry for speaking with such intemperance.
Merci.